Today we'll be discussing the career of the late Norm MacDonald, and we'll be discussing stem cell and bone marrow transplants. This is Doctor versus Comedian. I'm Dr. Asif Doja, and this is the Doctor of Laughs.
Not a real doctor.
Ali Hassan. Every episode I pick a topic for Ali from comedy and entertainment and I question him about it. Then Ali picks a topic from medicine and health and grills me on that topic. Today we'll be discussing the career of the late, great comedian Norm MacDonald, and we'll be discussing stem cell and bone marrow transplants. Now, how are these two related? Well, Norm MacDonald was almost famously secretive about an illness that he had for many years. He had multiple myeloma, which we will cover on a future episode, but he had apparently several stem cell transplants, and he also had chemotherapy, etc., and then he eventually passed away. We can talk about that a bit closer to the second part. But because they're related, we thought it would be good to chat about these things, right, Ollie?
Yes, that is right. I will say the last thing first, which is you should definitely watch this special if you haven't. I imagine if you're a fan of Norm MacDonald, you already have. It's been on Netflix for a little while. It was recorded in June of 2020. He passed away the next year. He recorded this special right before he was going in for a transplant, which of course we are going to go into some length about. But yeah, there will be spoilers, I guess, a little bit. I'm kind of sacred about comedy in this way. I don't want to ruin any of his jokes, but Norm MacDonald is this interesting person where, and I feel the same way about Bill Burr. I feel the same way about some of these comedians. If you just, somebody goes, I don't know who that is, and they just start watching now, it's like, no, you don't get the whole, like, how do I explain to my 13-year-old son who Norm MacDonald is? You got to go back. You got to watch the Weekend Updates. You got to watch his attempts at his own solo show. You got to understand why he was almost, you got to know this whole guy. And in all of that, this is such a good special. It's so good. And all I could keep thinking was like, man, this would have just killed on stage.
No, for sure. So why don't we get into Norm MacDonald, and then the second part, we're going to talk about stem cell transplants and, of course, his specific situation. Okay, Ali, let's talk about Norm MacDonald. Why don't we start with a bit of his early life, his connection to me, very minimal, because he grew up for high school. He was older than me, but he grew up in Ottawa for high school. He was born in Quebec City, and then his family moved here. He went to Gloucester High School, which is close by to where I live. And he says, he's a very unreliable narrator. If you listen to his stories.
Oh, and intentionally so.
Yeah. Apparently his book is just made up stuff. It's hilarious and apparently super well written. I'll link to a review of it. And apparently it's just so well written because he loved like Russian authors, like
Tolstoy, big fan of Tolstoy and Gogol.
And apparently it's amazing, but he is a very unreliable narrator. So he says that he dropped out at 16, but in fact he graduated early at 14. Went to a local university here.
So didn't drop out, graduated early because he's a certifiable genius. Okay.
Genius, exactly.
Yes.
Went to Carleton University here for a bit, studied math and philosophy. I mean, that's a smart person who's studying those things, right? Math probably as an arts degree as opposed to a science degree, and then basically went to Algonquin College, which is a community college here for a bit because his brother had done journalism there, and his brother is a famous Canadian newscaster, Neil MacDonald. He was the Washington bureau chief for many years. That's how most people in Canada know him. He was on the CBC, the same company Ollie works for. I think he retired a few years ago, though. I haven't seen him on television lately. I was reading somewhere it was 2019, but he may still do a few things. So that was his kind of early life. He had a bunch of jobs, early jobs, doing manual labor before he got into comedy. He was a choker man for a logging company. You know what a choker man is, Ollie?
No, but I think that's private about his personal life, and I don't think we need to bring that up.
Fair enough. A choker man attaches apparently cables to the logs to help them be moved.
No.
Yeah, so
That's tough work, by the way, Ben. And anything in logging, Jesus.
I know, exactly. And then he did stand up in Ottawa and started Yuck Yucks,
Which is where he and I have a connection.
Right.
We shared the same stage.
Right. You guys both did your first sets at Yuck Yucks in Ottawa, right? It wasn't your first amateur set?
It was my third. I think it was my third or fourth set was in Ottawa, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's so interesting. So that was about 20 years before you started doing comedy, Ollie?
Exactly. We shared a stage, but separated by 20 years.
And there's a story, the owner, Howard Wagman, do you know him?
Yeah, I know Howard, sure.
Okay, sure. So he, I guess... Norm MacDonald did his set. He thought it was so bad. He ran out, and Howard Wagman had to persuade him to come back. He said, no, it killed. It was amazing. You have to come back and do more, which is, I'm sure, very unusual for a club promoter to say that about a new comedian.
Sure. I'm sure Howie's worn that as a feather in his cap for many years, too. I'm the guy who brought Norm back. Otherwise, the world would have never seen Norm MacDonald. And I think if that's all true, we owe a debt of gratitude to Howard Wagman, too.
I mean, then afterwards, it's very quick. By the next year, Just for Laughs in Montreal, amazing. Then the Montreal Gazette there said he is one of the country's hottest comics. By 1990, he was on Star Search in the U.S. It was not a Canadian show, so he went to the U.S. and did that. And then he started appearing on Letterman. And Letterman said, if we could have Norm on every week, I would. So we could talk about it, but Letterman is a huge influence, probably the influence on Norm MacDonald. And of course, he had him on his show early on and helped with his success as a stand-up.
Mm-hmm.
Were you first exposed to him on SNL? Or did you know about him beforehand?
He never exposed himself to me. I just want to get that clear. As far as I know, it was all... No, I actually never met him, but I was indeed introduced to Norm on Weekend Update. For many years, I had no idea he was Canadian originally. And I don't know. I'm not sure what difference it makes, but it's definitely a source of pride. Definitely same thing with the Jim Carreys and the John Candys of the world. You do feel some sort of pride. And it hurts more if they do something bad with their life a little bit more. It's harder to ignore. But it's always great when you fall in love with somebody and then you go, and he's Canadian? This is the best news ever.
Yeah, I didn't know. I didn't even know he was from Ottawa till much, much later when he was on SNL. It wasn't a big thing that people heralded from Ottawa, which is too bad because, he's obviously...
Which is classic Ottawa, too, huh? Keep your head down, do the work, don't brag.
Totally. So, yeah, that's when I saw him, too. I loved his bits about David Hasselhoff. He'd always talk about Frank Stallone. Remember, he'd do the note to self where he did a portable tape recorder. He did that. I thought it was hilarious. And, of course, I went back in preparation for this and rewatched a compilation of all of his O.J. Simpson jokes. I mean, these were so brutal. And, again, Norm MacDonald. And, it was Jim Downey, who's a very famous SNL writer. People have been quoted as saying he's the second most important person to SNL after Lorne Michaels. Jim Downey was the head writer for many years and then a regular writer before and after his stint as head writer.
Yeah, and just on that note, for people who are fans, Conan O'Brien has a podcast, right? Conan Needs a Friend. There was a tribute to Norm MacDonald that they did. Conan also, like Letterman, being a massive fan of Norm MacDonald and everything he did.
I'm a huge fan.
And he talks to Jim Downey about Norm MacDonald. And it is amazing. It's everything you want it to be and more. Because those OJ jokes, it was very clear that it was going to cost him his job on Saturday Night Live if he continued to do it. I can't remember. I should know who. Don Ohlmeyer, maybe one of the exec.
It was Don Ohlmeyer. Yeah, he was the president of the NBC's West Coast division, who was really good friends with O.J. Simpson.
Yeah, so he was also friends with O.J. or had some sort of kinship with O.J. and he was like, cool it with the O.J. jokes. Norm did not, and then it was like, more sort of, you do another one of these jokes, you're done. And Norm was like, let's do it. That's who Norm was too, right? Like you talk about comedians who push the envelope.
Yeah, he had no fear. And he was calling out what the truth was, which is, O.J. Simpson, for all intents and purposes, I guess allegedly killed two people.
I guess allegedly is the best. That's how we have to speak. That's the dance we have to dance, unfortunately.
I know. O.J. Simpson sadly has passed away. But so I guess we can say it. I don't know. Whatever. It doesn't matter. But I listened to Jim Downey on Fly on the Wall a couple of weeks ago. It was an old episode. I was re-listening to it. And he said basically that Norm MacDonald was told by the higher-ups at Saturday Night Live that they're going to fire Jim Downey because of all these OJ jokes, because they wrote these jokes together. It was a pair. And Norm MacDonald said, nope, I'd rather you fire just me. And that's what happened. And Jim Downey, I think really appreciated that. Jim Downey's like, I'm not sure I would have done the reverse, if they said.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's what happened. It was pretty clear that's what happened. He being Norm MacDonald, talked about this on Howard Stern and David Letterman about what happened. So this is the history. And then, of course, afterwards, more stand-up. So many appearances on Conan. These are amazing. And Conan talks about how when Norm MacDonald would appear in his show, it's almost like Conan didn't need to be there, right? It was just Norm MacDonald telling these stories, ridiculous jokes that clearly weren't true. Obviously, he makes up everything in them, but that's the whole point. Oh, I went to ask you, Ali, did you ever see, a couple things that he was in. Did you ever see the movies he was in? He was in
Dirty Work. And then he had another thing called The Norm Show, which was a TV show. Did you watch either of those? I don't know if I watched The Norm Show. There was another. I didn't feel he was well suited to be a late night talk show host.
Mm-hmm,
I didn't feel like
he did that for a bit.
Yeah, that Weekend Update segment was amazing. His comedy was amazing. I felt like once you're a late night host, you are no longer doing a segment, and you are, as a host, speaking as somebody who's hosted quite a few things over my life, you're giving yourself up in favor of the guest, right? You are sort of, how many times Conan or Letterman would have to just let the guest be themselves. And, sometimes the guest is a little bit weak, then you come in, but you're always trying to make the guest shine. And I want Norm to shine. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I want Norm to be the guy who shines, and you shine less when you're the host, inevitably. So, yeah, I think I gave it a chance. If it wasn't the Norm Show, it was another late night show he was doing, and it wasn't the way I wanted to see Norm MacDonald.
And so we're going to transition into talk about his stand-up, especially this most recent special. But what is your impression of his style? I'm very curious. At the end of Nothing Special, this is the special that he taped the year before he died, they do something very interesting where the creators of the special on Netflix, they show the special and then they show a reaction afterwards for several of his friends. So it's Letterman, Dave Chappelle, Molly Shannon, Adam Sandler, Conan O'Brien.
Yeah, just to be clear, they don't show a reaction like facial reactions. They have a sit down for 35 minutes.
Exactly. Yeah,
with those six people. But just to make sure.
And it's immediately after they watch the special. So it's very raw. David Spade talked about this, how he was not in a good headspace, and he probably talks the least.
No, he barely spoke.
And is not really making jokes. And Letterman is doing more of a interviewing type thing, right? Asking the people there what their impressions were of Norm and how he came up with jokes and et cetera. So, yeah, but I want to get your opinions of his comedy style, specifically what you thought about him.
I was a big fan, and I think, I'll be honest with you, I didn't even know why I liked him. I couldn't articulate what I loved about Norm MacDonald. So, Laurie Jo Hoekstra, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, Laurie Jo Hoekstra, she was a writing assistant on SNL, and then she just became Norm MacDonald's sort of right-hand woman. She was just, it was like,
right.
People have described her as, it was like watching a piano being played by the right hand and the left hand, and Norm couldn't have done anything he did without her. They were basically joined at the hip. They lived in the same condo complex. This special is filmed at her house, and they have a long-standing 30-year plus, I believe, friendship that goes further than most friendships that we've heard about. The family's in awe of what kind of person she was for Norm. She says in an interview, and we'll link to the Washington Post article, she said, I don't know if having those six people there who are massive stars in their own right, talking about Norm, took away from the special. I see what she's saying. At some level, you'd want fans to sit there and digest what they just saw on their own and have that moment. But I will tell you, I don't know if there's anybody more articulate in the world of comedy than David Letterman, Dave Chappelle, and Conan O'Brien. They value words as much as, if not more than, we can go argue about that, Norm MacDonald himself. which is why they valued him. And hearing Conan talk about, not in this special, but on, in the tributes, but again, in this special, hearing Conan talk about what he loved about Norm MacDonald. This is a man who's like studied what Norm did. He's been right there, right? Feet away from him, studying exactly what he did. I think gives you even a better appreciation of Norm MacDonald and everything he did. So I wouldn't have had it any other way. And it's long. It's about a half an hour plus after the special that they talk. And it is, I don't know, like, it's the best people. None of them are trying to be funny. None of them are trying to be like, they did exactly what you would hope they did. They talked articulately and beautifully about their friend. Dave Chappelle has this beautiful thing. He says after his father died in the 90s, he was scheduled to be on a movie. He said, I did everything to get out of that movie. I was inconsolable about my father's death. I just didn't want to do anything. And I couldn't get out of this movie. And it sucked. And I met Norm MacDonald. And man, it was like the right person at the right time. He was like, he helped me heal. And Adam Sandler goes, did he talk to you about your father's death? Dave Chappelle said it never came up. But this man was just a bomb, like a BALM, like a bomb for me. Like he just healed me. And it was like going to church every day, going to work. I went from, I got to get out of this to, I can't wait to get back on set. I'm so excited. In that 8-10 weeks, I thought that was so beautiful. That's so beautiful. That makes you appreciate the special even more. It makes you appreciate Norm even more. So yeah, I shouldn't have taken Dave's, speaking of spoiler alerts, I took Dave's story out of Dave's mouth. But
that's okay. I mean, people can look this stuff up as well. Like, yeah, no, I agree. And apparently Norm MacDonald, very nice person, very kind person, which may not be what you'd think when you see his persona on stage.
Yeah.
So the special is basically him just speaking into a camera that's on a laptop. It's also filmed on an iPhone from the side, I believe.
At Laurie Joe's condo.
Yeah, and that's it. And he just does his special. He doesn't stop and restart. He barely pauses. I don't even know how he was reading or remembering his set.
That's what they were saying. Yeah, David Spade was like, "What? Did he have a set list? Like there was no fumbling, there was no look." It's a comment on how much he immersed himself in his stand-up.
Yeah, I don't know. It's quite remarkable what he does, and he's pausing. And so I watched it with subtitles for the first 5 or 10 minutes, and then I turned off subtitles. I usually watch things with subtitles, as do people, when they get older. But I turned it off because the key with his jokes is the pause. His pauses.
I totally did the exact same thing, man. So funny.
And then I'm like, I'm ruining the jokes for myself because you're reading ahead of him talking. So it's so funny he did the same thing because, and I didn't realize this, but all the comedians in the discussion afterwards are like, the way he chooses his words, he will purposely mispronounce words. And you think he's like just saying or mispronouncing something incorrectly, but he's not. Everything is thought out, which is amazing because it seems to me like it's not, but I guess that's the trick.
To me, that could be attributed to his math background. Everything is a formula. Math and philosophy, I mean, I think they come together a little bit in his comedy. I think the mispronouncing and the intentional thing, right? It's like, this is the formula that then leads to the laughter. And I saw that at the roast of Bob Saget. Like he's going at the end of the roast, after everybody's roasted Bob Saget, he's got to come up with something different. And he plugged something else completely into the formula. That also is to be seen. If you haven't seen it, it is a ridiculous collection of whatever you want to call dad jokes or corny jokes. It's ridiculous. And I don't think the bulk of the audience got it, but the comedians certainly did. And fans of Norm MacDonald certainly did.
Yeah.
But people who wanted a roast were like, what's this guy doing? This is ridiculous.
He's a comedian's comedian for sure. I think maybe the ultimate one from the past 30, 40 years. A couple things about this special, which tie into his comedy style. Like, the only time he repeats a joke is because it was a pretty funny joke. There was a dog barking. I guess Laurie's, is that her name? Her
Laurie
dog
Jo?
Her dog was barking. So that's the only joke he repeats.
He reminded me of you in that moment. He just did a pause, and in his eyes, you can see, I'm going to kill that dog. And then he got back to his work. Didn't really throw him off. Yeah. You also don't get that thrown off. You get back to your work.
By the way, you do think that everything was planned in that special, the nothing special,
Not the dog barking.
No, but his pauses and his repeating words and or stumbling on words, like that's all planned.
I do think so. I mean, a few stumbles here and there, maybe not. I think sometimes he's searching for the word. Man, I don't know. But yeah, sometimes it feels like he might be searching for the word. So he chooses one. He goes, no, I had a better word for that. And then goes to it. I think that's what I was watching in a couple of cases. But I would say 97% intentional.
It's so funny. He talks about his wife, Ruth, my wife, Ruth. And I'm like, oh, that's funny. I'm like, wait a minute. He's not married. He doesn't have a wife. And it's just, but the way he says it, I'm like, oh, maybe that was the woman he was talking to. No, that's Lori Joe. And he's not romantically attached. It was just so funny. He'll just make up stuff like this, right? Because that's part of the joke. And I don't know. I just thought it was so interesting. With his comedy style, okay, there's an interview with Mark Maron. Maybe you've read about this, where he's talking about the ideal joke is so evident that the punchline and the setup are the same thing. And he says he dislikes cleverness and innuendo because he says there's something cowardly about it. It's like cloaking it or something, but you're dissociating from what you actually mean. Just say what you actually mean. And then people are like, I guess like he's talking about that Comedy Central roast, and he's like, people are like, yeah, I got it. I got what you're doing. He's like, what is there to get? These are just the joke. Like, that's all there is. It's like he's thought about this so much, but his idea of the perfect joke is one from Weekend Update. I'm going to read it to you guys, but it's not quite as funny as it when he says it.
Do it in his voice. Do it in his voice.
And I can't. Do you want to do it in his voice? I have it on. Here.
Julia Roberts told reporters this week that her marriage to Lyle Lovett has been over for some time. The key moment, she said, came when she realized that she was Julia Roberts and she was married to Lyle Lovett.
That was very good, Ali. And you said it not just in his voice, but with the pauses, because those are so key, right? And I remember, as soon as I was reading up about this, I remember this joke from when he was on Saturday Night Live.
I totally remember too.
I loved this joke. I'm like, exactly. Because like you said, the punchline is the setup. Like, again, to be thinking like that about jokes, really fascinating stuff. Letterman, at the end of the special, says, he's like, yeah, this wasn't really a stand-up special, though. I think Letterman is saying you can't have a stand-up special without an audience. I know other people have done that. They talked about this guy, Drew Michael.
Dave Chappelle says, I owe him an apology because you can do a special with no audience, it turns out. And then, they had suggested, well, no, Drew Michael, it's a little different because he's making a choice to do that.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he's like, I'm going to do this. Whereas Norm was like, I need to get this all out in case something goes wrong with my treatment. So here we are. This is what it has to be, right? It was more sort of an obligation or, under duress.
And, like we were saying, Letterman had a lot of respect for Norm MacDonald. Did you see, Ali, when Norm MacDonald appeared in 2015 on the final Late Show with David Letterman? He was the final stand-up act.
It's one of the greatest weeks of television, man. Ray Romano was on that week too. Norm MacDonald was on that. And it was very emotional.
Yeah.
It's very emotional. I broke down a few times that week just with all the love David Letterman was getting, because it was like they were also saying that, like, no, you're not just great, Dave. Like, my life would not be my life. The people who have lived a life, Ray Romano's like, my kids don't have the life they have if not for you, Dave. You did everything. My family owes you everything. Like, it was just such a wow, like really. And Dave Letterman, of course, not good with being the center of attention and taking compliments. He's trying to deflect, and they're like, no. And Norm was like, very like, no. You need to listen to this. And he was trying to like change the subject. It's like, no, Dave, no, you have to hear what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Norm MacDonald does a joke that he heard Letterman do in the 1970s, where Norm MacDonald's in the audience at a Canadian talk show, and he remembers this joke and he repeats the exact joke. Basically, it's the joke that made him want to do stand-up when he was 13 years old. Amazing that he does that. And you're right, Norm MacDonald, you never see him like this, right? Like, kind of tearful, breaking down, like very emotional. So speaking of emotional, we should probably transition a bit into, let's just talk about some of his issues, health issues towards the end of his life. And then in the second aspect will segue into the stem cell treatment that he had. First of all, did you know he was a gambling addict?
Oh, yeah, of course, man. What the hell?
I didn't really know that. Honestly, I didn't know that till they were talking about it in that roundtable discussion after the thing. And
oh, no, dude, he's lost his like life savings. Like it was, that's not a bit. That's not a character. He loves gambling and he has lost it all multiple times.
Yeah, he lost his life saving 3 times.
And
the largest amount he lost at one time was $400,000. And he went bankrupt twice, apparently. So, yeah, that was definitely, I'm sure, a struggle. And then he developed a cancer called multiple myeloma. Like I said, we'll cover that in detail in a future episode. That was in 2013. And the craziest part about this is that apparently he did not tell any of his friends. The only people who knew were his family and Lori Joe, and that was it. And so none of his comedian friends knew. And then, he'd sometimes have to take medicine like steroids, and then he'd gain weight, and he'd just say, I'm eating a lot, I'm eating too much junk food, and you could see in some of these appearances, his face was different, right?
Face of it's swollen, yeah.
Yeah, like on the final Letterman one, he looks different than, he did in the past. And obviously his physical appearance really changed. He was a pretty good looking guy in the end. He dated Elle Macpherson, the supermodel, for a bit.
I always considered him somewhat handsome, but when he would do, and we just talked about this on an episode recently, because we were talking about our favorite SNL sketches, right? When he did Burt Reynolds, I remember thinking, I'll be damned if this guy's not as handsome as Burt Reynolds.
As Burt Reynolds, yeah, exactly. Just put that mustache on, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, as we were saying, nobody knew about his condition. I think maybe his agent also knew, but that was about it. He didn't want to change the way he was perceived. So he had multiple myeloma. He had several stem cell transplants, and he would use an alias every time he went to the hospital, so nobody would make a big deal about it. And of course, doctors, nurses, everybody has to keep it confidential. And his brother donated the stem cells. We'll talk about the donation in a second. He flew down from Canada, did that. And then he got chemotherapy. He got side effects like neuropathy, which is damage to your nerves from the chemotherapy that apparently was intensely painful for him. He had to give up golf and tennis, which he loved, apparently, those sports. And then his cancer went into remission. But then he developed a secondary treatment-associated cancer called a myelodysplastic syndrome. And it was because of that he then had repeated stem cell transplants and chemotherapy. And so what happened was he recorded the special before he underwent a stem cell transplant, because again, it's an intensive procedure, as we will talk about. And so he recorded the special beforehand. And then in 2021, he was getting a round of chemotherapy, went to the hospital for the chemotherapy, developed an infection, and then passed away, I think about 6 weeks later after that. So he died again in mid 2021 or so from that.
There's a sadness about going through all this borderline alone. As you said, he did, but that's right on brand. Not one person was really surprised. They might have been upset. Why you tell me, Conan was talking about that, but at the same time, like, we didn't know he was from Canada. We didn't know his connection. We didn't know. He has a son named Dylan who's 29 years old. Nobody knows about that. Nobody knows about his brother works for the CBC. When you see Norm MacDonald on stage, it could be an hour set. You have learned absolutely nothing about this man. Nothing genuine, right? This is kind of the weird thing and the amazing thing about him. So he was actually a very private person, and I think protected, I don't know, himself or people around him. I don't know what the objective was, but yeah, like even his memoir isn't a real memoir. You're learning nothing about him in a memoir. The whole thing is based on a true story, it says. But yeah, it's sad.
Well, yeah, to conclude this section, a totally unique person. Like, that's what everybody says. There's never going to be another person like him in the field of comedy or entertainment. Definitely check out this special, Nothing Special. It's really very interesting and amazing. There are some, I was crying laughing. I won't ruin it, but the joke about the cannibalism and the co-pilot.
So good.
So good. So funny. You have to watch it to see it, but Really, there are some real gems in it. And then I did a deep dive this week. I was looking at Weekend Update, his Conan appearances, and then the Letterman final appearance. All those things are really worth checking out.
All right, Asif, stem cell transplants. You'd have to be living under a rock to have not at least heard about stem cell treatment, but to know what it actually is a very, very different thing. And who, I think we should get to sort of who is eligible for this. I'd love to know about US, Canada. Like, is it something here that doctors recommend? Is it alternative therapy or treatment? Or is it something that do you get to a stage of a disease where you're like, okay, now we have to turn towards stem cell? Or is it a primary choice for some people? But obviously, first things first, we need to know what it is.
Yeah. So first of all, I think I need to clarify something for you, Ali, and probably our listeners too. We're not going to be talking about, so say, you've heard athletes who are like, oh, I'm going to get stem cell injections in my knee to help my cartilage and bones regrow, or someone who's like, oh, I have a Parkinson's disease, so I'm trying to do stem cell treatment in the brain. We're not talking about that. It's a very different kind of stem cell treatment.
Oh, okay. I didn't know about the knee thing, but we did talk about stem cell we were talking about Michael J. Fox and Parkinson's on a previous episode. So this is a different. This is a different. We were talking about stem cell transplants.
That's right. Okay. So in fact,
not injections.
A stem cell transplant, and you've heard of that. You've heard of a bone marrow transplant.
I have.
They're the same thing, because stem cells are found in the bone marrow. Because we're talking in this case, there's obviously neurologic stem cells from your brain. There's different kinds of stem cells. Stem cells are just cells that can develop into other kinds of cell types. They're kind of a primordial or very basic kind of cell, which has the potential to create new and different types of cells. But we're talking about what are called hematopoietic stem cells. So these are the ones that create your blood cells.
So you are saying that it's interchangeable bone marrow stem cell transplant. It's the same thing?
Correct.
Can we just say stem cell for this episode? Because when you talk about bone marrow, it does make me hungry and nostalgic for some great meals that I've had in my life. Is that weird?
People love eating the bone marrow. They love the bone marrow. Too soon. So we're not talking about that. Okay. So I have to talk about bone marrow in general, but you're right. I'll say stem cell transplant just to make it clear what we're talking about. And so again, these hematopoietic stem cells are found in the bone marrow, and they turn into our red blood cells, white blood cells that fight infection, and platelets, which are responsible for blood clotting. Okay, so in other words, you have this one stem cell, and it can turn into any of these kinds of cells. So right now you understand why it's a progenitor, or what we call a pluripotent stem cell. It can turn itself into all these different things. So that's pretty interesting. And they mature and move into your blood, and that's how we get our blood cells. So if bone marrow is damaged or destroyed, it can't make these cells, right? And that can be a problem. So the idea then, when you have the bone marrow transplant, is to give someone new stem cells.
Okay, I want to ask you about the types of stem cells, but I also want to know this. Stem cell transplants are for different types of cancer. It's not cancer of the bones or anything like this, right? Just the bone marrow contains something that can help you fight cancer.
Okay, so it's a very interesting. Okay, so yeah, how do they work against cancer? So stem cell transplants don't work against cancer directly. What they do is they allow doctors, especially if again, I'm simplifying it, but it's used for a lot of blood cancers, so leukemia, lymphoma, multiple myeloma, things like that. So what happens is, you say you've tried a treatment and it fails, a chemotherapy or radiation type treatment, it fails. Then sometimes they need to give you a higher dose of chemotherapy or other treatments like radiation therapy to destroy the cancer cells. But they're going to give you so much therapy, they're going to kill all the cells in your bone marrow. That's the idea. So they do that, and then they replenish your bone marrow with healthy donor stem cells, right? That's the idea.
Not concurrently, not while the chemotherapy is happening, because that would defeat the purpose.
No, exactly. So they wait a bit of time. Exactly. So basically you're destroying these cells on purpose, right? And There is some leukemias where the stem cell transplant will work against cancer directly. And that's because of an effect called graft versus tumor, where the graft actually starts attacking it. But that's a separate case. But in general, that's how it works. One of my friends and colleagues she actually had a bone marrow transplant, and she says it's so intense what they're doing, they're killing you to save your life. That's the idea. Not literally killing you, obviously, but it feels like that, and it's so intense, the treatment that they're giving you prior to getting the bone marrow transplant.
Sure. I mean, chemotherapy has been described in a similar way, right?
Yeah. But just thinking about we've had people in our family, Ollie and I, who've had chemotherapy, but thinking about how intense this chemotherapy is that they're giving, and that is destroying all your bone marrow, right?
Yeah. Okay. So tell me about these two different types of stem cell transplants.
Yeah, there's a couple different types, but there's two main types of stem cell transplant. So you could have what's called an allogenic stem cell transplant, where you get it from another person. So that's from a donor. And then you can have an autologous stem cell transplant where you provide your own stem cells. And so that could be before you get sick or before they deplete things, you can store these away. You can also get them from your identical twin, right? Because you'll have the exact same genetic makeup. So that's ideal. That's called a syngeneic transplant. So it's interesting, just taking a side here, I'll talk about the history of stem cell transplantation, because it started around the 1950s, and they did some mice studies where they found that infusing healthy bone marrow into a suppressed bone marrow could help the recipient mouse, right? So they thought that was interesting. So then they pretty quickly did the first transplant in New York City in 1957 to treat acute leukemia. And this was in two twins. So that was an easy transplant to do, right? Because they knew their genetics would be the same. And this was done by E. Donald Thomas, who basically received the Nobel Prize later on for his work in bone marrow transplantation. Then the first allogenic bone marrow transplant, so someone not from yourself, not from a twin, was done in 1968. And that was in a child who had something called severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome, where you can't make proper cells and components to fight infection. That's like, we've seen on Seinfeld, and there was a movie, the Bubble Boy syndrome, where people have to be in a bubble and be, that's the severe combined immunodeficiency syndrome is kind of like that syndrome. So now they treat it with bone marrow transplant quite early on if they don't respond to other therapies. So anyway, that's kind of the history of stem cell transplantation.
Okay, so how do you mentioned the twin, which leads me to think that not everybody can give just anybody stem cells. So how does that process work, finding the donor?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to do it. So first of all, you can get stem cells from bone marrow. That's what we talked about. You can get it from blood, but blood doesn't have a lot of stem cells, so you have to give what are called growth factors to stimulate the amount of stem cells from the blood. Or you might have heard of people getting from umbilical cord blood. When babies are born now, you often will be approached, do you want to store some cord blood? Because the umbilical cord has a lot of stem cells in it. So people will store their baby's cord blood to be used at a later date, perhaps for a sibling, perhaps for themselves, right? Or you can also donate them to a public donor bank if you want. So then people would be able to access.
Oh, interesting. We were not asked when our children would be.
Yeah, no, I remember we got a pamphlet about it. We didn't do it. But, I don't think it's a bad idea if people want to do it, especially if you have the ability to donate to a public bank. That would be a nice thing to do.
Sure. What are you doing with that umbilical cord anyway?
Exactly. Yeah.
Wearing it as a scarf.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you need to find a donor, as you said, though, right? And the donor cells need to match the recipients as closely as possible to avoid side effects, which we'll talk about. So that's a process called HLA testing to make sure that people are closely matched. So you could look at thousands of people, but really the best is close family members. They're the most likely to have a genetic match to you and be closest. Brothers and sisters are the best because obviously brothers and sisters have the combined DNA from both parents. So that's usually how we look at. Neil MacDonald was Norm MacDonald's brother who donated his bone marrow for this. There are registries. So in Canada, we have the Canadian Blood Surface Stem Cell Registries to see if you could be a match. But it can be difficult. One of the challenges is tougher in kids who may not have siblings who are old enough, right, to donate blood. And if people didn't store their umbilical cord blood. And the problem was, not a problem, but she was mixed race, like kind of like my kids, right? So it becomes a lot harder to find genetic matches in your family because maybe other people aren't mixed race. And they had to actually get it from a public bank, I think, is somewhere in Asia is where they end up getting it from.
So this is why people should marry their cousins, right? That way you just go to your wife, who's probably, or your husband. No. Okay. Just saying that that's a thing that happens out there. And I'm sure when it does, there have been some husband-wife matches, which is...
Yeah, I don't really know how to respond to that, but that's okay. Yeah, okay.
No, and even I find it awkward that I said it out loud. Okay. So what does this transplant look like? I mean, you have to go into the bone, right?
Yeah, so this is what happens. So you take stem cells from the bone marrow, say from the donor, and you'll be put to sleep, and they put a very large needle into the back of your hip bone, right? And they insert it and they draw out the bone marrow.
Is it painful for people once they wake up?
You're sore. It's not the worst pain ever, but
Okay.
You're sore, and that would go away in like several days or 2 weeks, but it's
Okay.
not, it's certainly not like donating a kidney or something like that, where,
Right.
you're having a major surgery to remove your kidney. It's nothing like that. So, you do recover over time, and it takes a couple hours to do that. Then they store that. Then, of course, we have the actual person who's getting the transplant, right? So you will start off by getting this conditioning or intensive therapy, which we talked about, right? So you need to, A, destroy any cancer cells that are still in the body, and B, make room in the bone marrow for the donor cells. And the other thing that conditioning or intensive therapy, this is the high dose chemotherapy, is doing, is suppressing your immune system to lower the chance of rejecting the transplanted stem cells. So you do that. That can be a variable amount of time. And then sometimes you get radiation therapy. And then the transplant is done 1 to 3 days after the end of this conditioning or intensive therapy. So then you get the stem cells, and then you have this time period where you're waiting for engraftment. That's when the transplanted stem cells then enter your bloodstream, make their way to the bone marrow, and start making new blood cells. But it takes 2 to 6 weeks to see the return of normal blood cells from this transplant. So during that time, the 2 to 6 weeks, you have no ability to fight infection, right? You have no ability to create new blood cells. So you need to get blood transfusions and platelet transfusions. I need to be on lots of medications to prevent infection, antibiotics, antifungals, antivirals, and maybe even medicine to prevent the side effects of rejecting the transplant, right? So I always say this, they don't do bone marrow transplants in my hospital, but when I trained in Toronto, they did them there. And if we ever got a neurology consult to see somebody on the bone marrow transplant ward or the stem cell transplant ward, these are the sickest patients in the hospital, almost by far.
Oh, gosh.
Because they have so little ability to fight infection. So if they're getting sick with a neurologic condition, you think, well, what is the possibility? Is it because they don't have enough platelets and they're getting a blood clot, or they're getting a bleed in their brain, I should say? Is it because they are getting an infection? And if they get an infection, what could it be? It could be some strange rare fungus because they have zero ability to fight infection. So it's a very precarious time. And I think that's the stress, is that period of time where you're waiting for the transplant to take effect.
What does that rejection look like? What happens to your... I'm picturing some horror scenes from like the movie Alien or...
Yeah. So especially if you have an allogenic transplant, because obviously that's someone who's not going to have the exact identical DNA as you. It's not your own. It's not your identical twins. Then you can get a couple things. You can get what's called graft versus host disease. So that's when the donor's bone marrow, the graft, sees cells in your body and thinks that they're a foreign invader and is attacking them, right? So that's kind of crazy when you think about it. It's supposed to help you, but then it can damage your skin. your liver, intestines, and other organs. So you can get it sometimes acutely in the first 3 months after transplant, but you can also get a chronic graft versus host disease, which can occur 3 months or later after a transplant. And so it's a balance, right? You need to treat with like steroids or other drugs to suppress the immune system, but you don't want to suppress it too much. So it's a bit of a balance to do that. And sometimes they will treat the donor stem cells with a process to remove certain white blood cells called T cells. And that's called T cell depletion. And that can reduce the risk of graft versus host disease. So that would definitely be a complication for sure. But then you could also get graft failure. So you wait for several weeks and then you realize the stem cells aren't producing new blood cells, right? And then they kind of just fail. They can sometimes give a treatment to try and stimulate that, again, with these growth factors, something called erythropoietin. But if that doesn't work, then you have to stop sometimes the immune suppressive medicines, but then sometimes if it totally doesn't work, then you have to try another stem cell transplant after that, which is, again, an issue. And then you could have complete graft rejection, where the body rejects the transplanted stem cells completely, especially if that occurs in allogenic transplants, if the donor is unrelated or not very well matched. And then again, you can sometimes treat that with growth factors and things like that. But then again, sometimes you need to do another transplant after that. So these are all kind of the possibilities related to the graft. That's in addition to the risk of the side effects, which is the low blood counts, the infection, which we talked about before. It's definitely a serious thing to have done. Like I said, it's probably one of the most, you think about that, heart transplant maybe, these are like huge medical procedures that people do. A lot of, again, potential complications. But I mean, Norm MacDonald, I don't know what to say. He had a couple of transplants, stem cell transplants, from what I understand, and did okay after those, right? His last one, if it was around 2020 when he did the special, then he was alive for at least another year after that. And it was actually from chemotherapy that he ended up getting a complication, not from the transplant. So it sounds like he tolerated them well. I don't have the data about why he needed more than one.
Do you know what that complication was from chemotherapy? What is that?
I'm guessing from reading some of the articles, and we're all into those, that he got an infection. I don't know what kind of infection, and that's what he sadly passed away from. So that's our episode for today. Obviously a bit of a sadder episode remembering Norm MacDonald, but really there's also a lot of joy if you think about his stand-up and what he brought to the stand-up world. Again, like we mentioned, a totally unique voice. Definitely, if you guys get the time, just go check out some of these clips that are online. So hilarious. Reach out to us.
The holidays are coming up. You want to escape from your children or your family members? Just go to a bathroom and spend some time with Norm MacDonald, huh? That's what I would say.
Exactly. And I think that last special is definitely worth watching. It's definitely sad, especially the end, seeing the reaction of some of the people there. Like Ali and I were saying, some of the people there are just kind of trying to deal with, his passing. David Spade hardly says anything. Molly Shannon doesn't say very much either. I think they're just really overwhelmed with the situation, but it's definitely worth watching to get insight into Norm MacDonald, what we can. So let us know what you guys thought about this episode. drvcomedian@gmail.com, drvcomedian on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We are everywhere. The Blue Sky is coming eventually. It's in progress. And let us know what you guys thought.
Or will you get kicked off of it like you did with TikTok, huh? Who knows? Amazing.
This is all possible.
All possible.
And yeah, and then of course we talked about stem cell transplants. Let us know what you thought about that. Again, future episodes, we will cover multiple myeloma, I'm sure. And we also hopefully can look into the other kinds of stem cell transplants that people are getting. So not related to blood cells, but the other ones. A bit less scientific evidence for those, but we could talk about what's going on with those. So let us know if you guys want to hear about those topics. And Ali, what do you got going on December? You mentioned the holiday season.
Yeah. I'll be on television New Year's Eve with Ian Hannah-Mansing and myself will be co-hosting the CBC New Year's Gala. So that'll be great. And then in the new year, closer to the end of January, I'll be Niagara-on-the-Lake, Laugh Out Loud. CBC's Laugh Out Loud will be in Niagara-on-the-Lake late January. Then we'll be in Moncton 25th anniversary of the Hubcap Comedy Festival, one of the greatest festivals in this country. Just love it.
When is that?
That's the 30th of January.
Mm.
And then I head out west for some shows in Maple Ridge and Kelowna and Edmonton. I'm doing a 4-day run in Edmonton. I'll talk more about that.
Wow. Very exciting.
Yeah.
But before we go, just remember that although I'm a doctor, I'm not your doctor. Medical issues we talk about are for your interest and information only, and they're not medical advice. Please consult your medical professionals for actual medical advice. Thanks for listening.
Bye-bye.